The college werewolf cheerleader keeps dragging me to practice. She says I balance her. I spent my first semester at Hellion trying to be invisible, because being a human on a mega-university world full of superspecies feels like being a porcelain doll inside an industrial rock tumbler. I thought I had absolutely nothing to offer this place until a girl with white wolf ears and a terrifying vertical leap looked at me with desperation in her golden eyes and told me that my steady heartbeat was the only thing loud enough to drown out the predatory noise in her head. It turns out that being the quietest thing in the room isn't a weakness when the person you love is constantly fighting a war against her own biology. That realization did not come easily or quickly for a guy like me. You have to understand that Hellion campus is not designed for standard human tolerances. It is a world terraformed specifically for athletic supremacy, where the gravity plating in the sidewalks is dialed up by 5% just to keep everyone's calves toned, and the air carries a distinct metallic tang of performance supplements and high-yield energy drinks. Every hallway is a runway for genetic perfection, and every open quad is an impromptu sparring ground for species that could bench press my entire dorm room without breaking a sweat. I'm a structural engineering major on a scholarship that was likely a clerical error, so my days are usually spent dodging casual displays of superhuman dexterity while trying to keep my head down and my datapad active. My survival strategy was simple, and that was to be the background static in a high-definition broadcast. I wore baggy hoodies to hide my lack of muscle mass compared to the Ursine linebackers, and I took the service tunnels to avoid the main concourse rush hours, where a casual shoulder check from a reptilian sprinter could dislocate my shoulder. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my carefully constructed invisibility began to crack. I needed to get to the Advanced Materials Lab on the north side of the athletics sector, and the maglev tram was down for unscheduled maintenance, which forced me to cut through the orbital gym. This is not a gym in the way you might think of a room with weights and treadmills. The orbital gym is a cathedral of glass and reinforced composites that is large enough to house a small fleet of atmospheric shuttles. The ceiling is a vaulted dome of transparent aluminum that looks out into the pale violet sky of the planet, and the floor is a smart grid of impact-absorbing polymers that can change density on command. It is the training ground for the university's most celebrated gods and monsters, and usually I would walk the perimeter walkway to avoid drawing attention to myself. On this particular day, the main floor was dominated by the varsity cheer squad. Calling them cheerleaders feels like an insult to the sheer kinetic violence of what they do. At Hellion Cheer is not about waving pom-poms or shouting rhymes. It is an aerial combat simulation choreographed to music, where the flyers are launched into the upper atmosphere of the dome to perform maneuvers that would make a fighter pilot blackout. I paused near the heavy double doors of the north exit because the sound of their practice was physically overwhelming. The rhythmic thud of 60 highly conditioned bodies hitting the mats in unison vibrated through the soles of my shoes and up into my teeth. I adjusted the strap of my tactical backpack, which was heavy with textbooks, and a prototype suspension bridge model I had built for my thesis, and I tried to make myself small against the wall. That was when I saw her. Vex was impossible to miss even in a squad of apex predators. She was the captain and the primary flyer, which meant she was lighter and faster than the heavy lifters who threw her, but she was still pure power wrapped in white fur and gold and black spandex. She had a long ponytail of white hair that whipped around like a lash, and her wolf ears were flattened against her skull in intense concentration. She was shouting orders that cut through the noise of the arena with terrifying clarity, and I watched as she berated a massive Minotaur base for being 2 milliseconds slow on the catch release. There was a wildness to her movements that looked less like sport and more like a contained explosion. Her claws were visible even from where I stood, and they dug into the shoulders of her teammates as she climbed the human pyramid with a grace that made my engineering brain ache with admiration. I should have kept walking. I should have pushed through the doors and gone to my lab where the variables were controlled and the only stress was a complex integral equation. but I stood there frozen by the spectacle of it. They were setting up for a maneuver I had heard rumors about called the orbital drop. It required the three strongest bases to launch the flyer nearly 40 feet into the air, where she would perform a triple corkscrew rotation before plummeting back down to be caught mere inches from the floor. It was a stunt that had been banned in 3 sectors for being too dangerous, but on Hellion it was just Tuesday. I watched as the formation tightened. The energy in the room shifted and became razor sharp. I could see the tension in Vex's body from 50 yards away. She was vibrating with adrenaline. Her tail was stiff, and her muscles were coiled so tight they looked like steel cables beneath her fur. She signaled the launch, and the bases heaved upward with a synchronized grunt that sounded like a thunderclap. Vex shot into the air like a missile. It was beautiful for exactly 1.5 seconds. She hit the apex of her climb near the ventilation struts of the ceiling and began the rotation. It was perfect geometric precision. But then something happened. A sudden flicker in the gym's artificial lighting, or perhaps a momentary lapse in the gravity scrubbers, caused one of the bases to stumble just a fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic error, but in a system with that much kinetic energy, a microscopic error is catastrophic. The base shifted his footing, and the formation collapsed. Vex was 30 feet in the air and coming down fast. The bases scrambled to reset their positions, but they were panicked and out of sync. They were looking at each other instead of the sky. I saw the trajectory instantly. My mind is wired for load paths and vectors, and I didn't see a girl falling. I saw a mass of approximately 55 kilograms accelerating at 9.8 meters per second squared on a parabolic arc that would terminate 5 feet to the left of the safety mat. She was going to hit the hardwood floor, and at that speed and angle the impact would shatter her pelvis and likely compress her spine. The entire gym seemed to inhale at once. The silence that followed the collapse was heavier than the noise had been. No one was moving fast enough. The Minotaur was too slow to pivot, and the spotters were on the wrong side of the formation. I didn't make a conscious decision to move. There was no heroic swell of music in my head. There was only the equation and the error and the immediate need to correct it. I dropped my shoulder and let the heavy tactical bag slide down my arm. I grabbed the strap as it fell and swung it with all my strength, using the momentum to propel myself forward. I sprinted. I'm not fast compared to a lichen or a reptilian sprinter, but I had the angle and I had the math. I crossed the boundary line of the mats, and my sneakers squeaked violently against the polymer. Vex was falling with her back to the ground, and her eyes were wide open. I could see the gold irises blown wide with a primal realization of death. She wasn't screaming. She was bracing. Her body had gone rigid, which was the worst thing she could do because a rigid structure breaks while a flexible one bends. I didn't try to catch her with my hands because that would have broken my wrists. I threw my body into the space where she was going to land. I planted my feet wide and bent my knees to lower my center of gravity, and I opened my arms to create a cradle. I calculated the impact point and adjusted my torso just as she slammed into me. The force was immense. It felt like being hit by a falling sandbag made of iron. The air left my lungs in a violent whoosh, and my vision grayed out for a microsecond. I was knocked backward, but I twisted as we fell to ensure that I took the brunt of the impact with the floor. We hit the ground hard and slid 3 meters across the polished wood. My back screamed in protest as it scraped against the floor, but I kept my arms locked around her. We came to a stop in a tangle of limbs near the bleachers. For a long moment there was no sound in the universe except the high-pitched ringing in my ears. I was staring up at the lights, trying to remember how to inhale. There was a heavy weight on my chest and a distinct smell of cedar wood and ozone and hot copper. Then the weight moved. Vex pushed herself up on her hands. She was straddling my waist, her knees pinned to the floor on either side of my ribs. Her uniform was askew, and her hair was a wild halo of white static. But it was her face that terrified me. Her lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed teeth designed to tear muscle from bone. Her eyes were glowing with a biological luminescence that signaled a fight-or-flight override. Her claws were fully extended and pressing into the fabric of my hoodie, right over my heart. This is the part where I should have been afraid. Any rational survival instinct would have told me to shove her off and run because a startled lichen is about as safe as a live grenade. But I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange detachment. My brain was still running the diagnostics. Subject is intact. Deceleration successful. No audible snaps. Breathing is rapid but unobstructed. "Are your landing gears intact?" I asked. My voice sounded incredibly small in the cavernous silence of the gym. It was a stupid thing to say. I sounded like a mechanic asking about a faulty landing strut. Vex blinked. The golden glow in her eyes didn't fade, but the snarl faltered. She looked down at her hands, which were currently threatening to eviscerate a freshman engineer, and then she looked at my face. She leaned in closer, and I could feel the heat radiating off her skin. It was like lying underneath a furnace. She took a ragged breath in through her nose, sniffing me. The reaction was instantaneous. The tension that was holding her body in that rigid, terrifying shape just evaporated. Her claws retracted with a soft click. Her ears, which had been pinned back in aggression, swiveled forward. The growl that had been building in her chest died out and was replaced by a confused huff of air. She collapsed. She didn't faint, but she just let go. She slumped forward until her forehead rested against my sternum. Her entire weight settled onto me, and she let out a long, shuddering sigh that vibrated through my ribcage. It was bizarre. 1 second she was a weapon primed to detonate, and the next she was just a heavy, exhausted girl using me as a human mattress. I lay there awkwardly patting her shoulder with a tentative hand. "You're okay," I whispered. "You didn't hit the floor." The rest of the squad finally caught up to reality. I heard the thunder of footsteps as the team rushed over. Jackson, the linebacker who had missed the catch, was leading the charge. He looked terrified, not for me, but of her. "Captain," Jackson bellowed, "back off the human, give him space." Vex stiffened against me, but she didn't move away. She lifted her head slowly and looked at her team. The transition was jarring. When she looked at me, she was confused and soft, but when she turned her head to address Jackson, the predator snapped back into place. "I'm fine," she snapped. Her voice was rough like gravel tumbling in a mixer. She pushed herself off my chest and stood up on shaky legs. She wobbled for a second, and I instinctively reached out to steady her, grabbing her elbow. Jackson flinched as if he expected her to bite my hand off. Touching the captain without permission was apparently a capital offense in their social hierarchy, but Vex didn't bite me. She looked down at my hand on her arm and then back up at my eyes. There was a question there, a deep burning curiosity that unsettled me more than the teeth had. "You caught me," she said. "It wasn't a question, it was an accusation." The trajectory was off, I explained, scrambling to my feet and dusting off my shorts. "Basic physics. You were drifting left. They couldn't have adjusted in time." She stared at me. She was taller than me by 3 inches, and with the ears it felt like a foot. She loomed. "Who are you?" "Leo," I said. I'm nobody. I just cut through here for the lab. I should go." I turned to leave. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and the squad of genetically enhanced athletes staring at me like I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. I reached down to grab my bag, which was lying forlornly on the floor where I had dropped it. But I didn't get far. Cool fingers wrapped around my wrist. The grip was iron hard. I stopped and looked back. Vex had hold of me. She wasn't looking at me, though. She was looking at her hand on my wrist as if she didn't quite understand why she had reached out. "My legs," she said quietly. The command in her voice was gone, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to a plea. "They feel like jelly. The adrenaline crash. I can't walk to the locker room alone." I looked at Jackson and the other bases. They were massive. Any one of them could have carried her with one arm. "Your team can help you," I suggested, gently trying to extricate my wrist. Vex tightened her grip. Her golden eyes locked onto mine, and the desperation I had seen earlier flared hot and bright. "No," she hissed. "They're too loud. Their hearts. They're racing. It makes the noise in my head worse." She took a step closer, crowding my personal space until I was breathing in the scent of her. "You're quiet, your pulse. It's slow. It stops the shaking." I looked down at her hands. She was right. The tremors that had been racking her body since the fall were subsiding. Where her skin touched mine, she was perfectly still. "Just to the locker room," she whispered. I looked around the gym. The other cheerleaders were watching us with open mouths. The silence stretched out a long, uncomfortable rubber band waiting to snap. I knew in that moment that if I walked her to that door, I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I was stepping out of the background and into the spotlight of a very dangerous stage. But then I looked at her eyes again. Beneath the predator's gold and the captain's arrogance, there was just a girl who was terrified of her own biology and who had found a temporary anchor in the storm. "Okay," I said softly, "just to the locker room." She didn't smile, but her shoulders dropped another inch. She leaned some of her weight against me, and we began to walk. I could feel the eyes of the entire gym boring into my back. I adjusted my bag and felt the pom-pom charm she hadn't given me yet. In the future I didn't know was coming. For now I was just a structural prop, a walking crutch. As we walked, she didn't let go of my wrist. In fact, she slid her hand down until her fingers were interlaced with mine. It wasn't romantic. It was tactile desperation. She needed the data input of my calm to regulate her own system. I kept my breathing steady, forcing my heart to beat in a slow, rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. "Don't let me fall," she murmured as we reached the double doors, her voice so low only I could hear it. "I've got you," I said. And for the first time in my life on Hellion campus, I actually felt like I was telling the truth. I pushed the doors open, and we stepped out of the bright, harsh lights of the arena and into the cool shadows of the corridor, leaving the noise behind us. My quiet life was over. I just didn't know it yet. My calculation that my quiet life was over proved to be the most accurate prediction I had made all semester. I naively thought that after depositing Vex at the locker room door and extracting my hand from her iron grip, I could simply fade back into the woodwork of the university infrastructure. I assumed that a creature of her status would treat our interaction like a shameful anomaly to be buried under the rug of her social dominance. I went back to my dorm room that night and stared at the ceiling and convinced myself that I was just a temporary crutch for a bad landing, and that by morning, the natural order of Hellion campus would reassert itself. The lions would walk with the lions, and the structural engineers would walk with the shadows, and everything would return to its equilibrium. I was wrong. The disruption of my routine began at exactly 0700 hours the next morning. I was sitting in the back corner of the cafeteria Sector 4, which is usually reserved for the non-combatant species and the exchange students who can't handle the high-protein gruel served in the main hall. I was nursing a cup of synthesized caffeine and reviewing the stress test data for my bridge model when a hush fell over the room. It wasn't the polite silence of a library, but the instinctive silence of a forest when a predator steps onto the path. I didn't look up immediately because I was trying to solve a differential equation regarding tensile strength, but then a shadow fell across my datapad. It wasn't just a shadow, it was an eclipse. I looked up to find Vex standing on the other side of my table. She wasn't in her uniform this time, but the civilian clothes she wore were somehow more intimidating because they made her look like a person rather than a symbol. She wore a heavy flight jacket with the collar turned up and dark leggings that looked like they were woven from ballistic armor. Her white hair was pulled back in a severe knot that exposed the sharp tips of her ears, and her golden eyes were scanning my face with the intensity of a biological scanner. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if the seat was taken. She simply pulled the metal chair out with a screech that made half the room flinch and sat down directly across from me. She placed a datapad on the table between us and slid it forward with a single manicured claw. The screen was displaying a complex graph of biometric telemetry. I looked at the jagged red lines that spiked and plummeted like a chaotic stock market, and then I looked at the flat green line that dominated the last sector of the timeline. "Explain this," she said. Her voice was low and lacked the growl from the gym, but it had a density to it that vibrated in the water in my cup. I leaned forward and adjusted my glasses. I recognized the data immediately because I had spent half my life looking at frequency waves. "This is heart rate variability overlaid with cortisol production," I said, analyzing the peaks. "The red spikes indicate extreme physiological stress bordering on a cardiac event. The green line represents a state of near comatose relaxation. What is the variable?" "You are the variable," Vex stated. She tapped the screen where the red line turned green. "This timestamp correlates exactly to the moment you caught me. The suppression of my adrenal response lasted for 4 hours after you left. Usually it takes me 6 hours of meditation and a sedative to reach those levels after a failed drop. Yesterday I achieved it in seconds." I sat back and processed this information. She wasn't here for romance, and she wasn't here to thank me. She was here because she was an elite athlete who had discovered a performance-enhancing hack, and she wanted to understand the mechanics of it. To her, I was a piece of equipment that she hadn't calibrated yet. "It's a biological feedback loop," I theorized, keeping my voice clinical to match hers. "You were in a sympathetic nervous system overdrive. My baseline physiological state is extremely low compared to yours. When we made contact, your mirror neurons likely latched onto my respiratory rate and heart rhythm as a reference point. It's entrainment. Your body synced to mine because mine was the stable constant in a chaotic moment." Vex stared at me for a long time. Her golden pupils contracted and dilated as she processed the science. Then she nodded once as if I had passed a test I didn't know I was taking. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a schedule which she slapped down on top of the biometrics. "Practice is at 1400 hours," she said. "Don't be late." "I have a fluid dynamics lecture at 1400, I countered. I wasn't trying to be difficult, but I had a GPA to maintain, and I didn't see how being a glorified emotional support animal fit into my degree plan. Vex narrowed her eyes. "I checked your schedule. The lecture is recorded and available on the campus network. The attendance is optional. My practice is not." She stood up and the movement rippled with that same terrifying grace I had seen on the mats. "If I fall again, I break. If I break, we lose the sector championship. You are the only safety net that actually works. Be there." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked away, leaving a wake of confused silence in her path. I watched her go, and I realized that I had absolutely no choice in the matter. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of necessity. And perhaps in some deep recessed part of my brain that was tired of being invisible, it was also an invitation. I arrived at the gym at exactly 13:55. I walked through the service entrance to avoid the main concourse, but the atmosphere inside was already charged with the electricity of high-stakes athletics. The squad was stretching on the mats, a sea of varied species and terrifying musculature. Jackson, the Minotaur, was doing push-ups with 2 other teammates sitting on his back. When I walked onto the floor, the conversation died instantly. 60 pairs of predatory eyes locked onto me. I felt like a gazelle that had wandered into a lion's den, not to be eaten, but to deliver a pizza. It was absurd and terrifying. Vex was in the center of the mat, tapping her wrists. She didn't look up when the room went quiet, but her ears swiveled toward my footsteps. She pointed a taped finger toward the bleachers on the 50-yard line without breaking her focus. "Sit," she commanded. "Row 3, center." I walked to the designated spot and sat down. I pulled my datapad out of my bag and opened my fluid dynamics textbook, trying to build a wall of academic solitude around myself. I could feel the skepticism radiating from the team. They whispered to each other in guttural tongues and clicked their mandibles in amusement. They didn't understand why the captain had brought a squishy human to a war council. Jackson stood up and lumbered over to the edge of the mats, glaring at me with arms crossed over a chest that was wider than a transport hatch. "Is this a joke, Captain?" Jackson rumbled, his voice vibrating the floorboards under my feet. "He's a distraction. If a stiff breeze blows through the ventilation, he might break. We don't need a mascot." Vex finished tapping her wrist and stood up. She was a head shorter than Jackson, but she seemed to take up twice as much space. She walked up to him until they were nose to nose, or rather nose to pectoral muscle. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She just looked at him with a cold, flat gaze that promised violence. "He is not a mascot," she said quietly. "He is structural integrity. And if you question my equipment again, Jackson, you will be running laps until your hooves crack. Get in formation." Jackson held her gaze for a second and then looked away. He grunted and backed down, retreating to his position. The hierarchy was re-established. Vex turned and looked at me up in the stands. She didn't smile, but she gave a microscopic nod. It was an acknowledgement. "Stay put. Do your job." My job apparently was just to exist. For the next 2 hours I sat there and solved equations while bodies flew through the air at terminal velocity. At first it was impossible to concentrate. The sounds of impact were visceral, but slowly I began to notice the rhythm. I saw Vex looking up at me between sets. She would land a stunt, her chest heaving and her eyes wild, and then she would snap her head toward the bleachers. She would find me sitting there boring and still and unmoving, and I would see the tension drain out of her shoulders. It was like she was checking a compass. As long as I was there pointing north, she knew where she was. The difference in her performance was statistically significant. I started tracking it on a side window of my datapad. Her reaction times were up by 0.4 seconds. Her landings were cleaner. The frantic edge to her movements smoothed out into a cold, precise lethality. She wasn't fighting the fear anymore, she was using it. The team noticed it too. The whispers changed from mockery to confusion and then to a grudging respect. They didn't know what I was doing, but they couldn't argue with the results. This routine continued for 2 weeks. Every day she would find me. Every day I would go to the gym. I became a fixture, a piece of furniture that the team learned to navigate around. But I wasn't just watching. I was analyzing. I noticed that Vex crashed hard after practice. The physiological cost of being a lichen in a high-stress environment was massive. She burned calories at a furnace rate, and the electrolyte depletion caused her hands to shake when the adrenaline wore off. The commercially available sports drinks on Hellion were designed for reptilians and avians, full of heavy salts and sugars that made her sluggish. I watched her grimace as she choked down a neon blue sludge during a break, and my engineering brain saw a problem that needed a solution. I spent a night in the chemistry lab adjusting a formula. I looked up the metabolic requirements for lichen biology, focusing on rapid ion replacement and neural stabilizers. I synthesized a blend that was pH balanced for her specific biology and flavored it with a synthetic meat protein extract that cut the sweetness. It was chemistry, not cooking, but the intent was the same. The next day, when she came to the sidelines gasping for air and reaching for her blue sludge, I handed her a plain metal flask instead. "Don't drink that," I said. "It's spiking your insulin and crashing your potassium. Drink this." She looked at the flask and then at me. She sniffed it cautiously. Her nose twitched. "What is it?" "Fuel," I said. "High-grade sodium electrolytes with a magnesium buffer to stop the tremors. I adjusted the specific gravity to match your blood plasma so it absorbs faster." She took a tentative sip. Her eyes widened. She drank the entire flask in one long swallow and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at her hands. They were steady as rocks. She looked at me with a new expression. It wasn't just the need for calm anymore. It was surprise. "You made this," she said. "I engineered it," I corrected. "There's a difference." She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. She handed the flask back to me and said, "Fill it again tomorrow." But as she ran back to the formation, she touched my shoulder. It was a brief contact, a grazing of fingers against my hoodie, but it felt like a lightning strike. That was the turning point. The team stopped looking at me like an intruder. I started bringing larger batches of the mix, and soon half the squad was stopping by the bleachers to get a Leo special before the heavy lifts. I became the unofficial alchemist of the varsity squad. I was no longer the weird human in the stands, I was the resource manager. But Vex needed to make it official. She needed to claim me in a way that the rest of the university would understand. It happened on a Friday before the big game against the Tech World Marauders. The gym was packed with onlookers and scouts. The atmosphere was thick with aggression. I was packing up my bag to leave after practice, trying to beat the rush, when Vex intercepted me near the exit. She was flanked by her lieutenants, two predatory avian girls with razor-sharp beaks who usually terrified me. Vex stopped in front of me and blocked my path. The gym went quiet again. People were watching. This was theater. "Give me your bag," she said. I handed over my heavy tactical backpack, wondering if she was going to search it for contraband. She didn't open it. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a charm. It was a miniature version of her squad pom-pom, white and gold and fluffy, but it was attached to a heavy carabiner made of titanalloy. It wasn't a cute trinket. It was a badge. On Hellion, giving someone a piece of your gear was a sign of pack integration. It meant this thing belongs to us. She clipped the charm onto the main strap of my bag right next to my multi-tool. The metal clicked loudly in the silence. She gave it a tug to make sure it was secure. "You're walking with a limp," she said, observing my gait. "Your load distribution is uneven." "Books are heavy," I muttered, staring at the fluffy white ball attached to my tactical gear. It looked ridiculous. It looked perfect. "We handle heavy things," she said. She looked over her shoulder at Jackson. "Carry his bag." Jackson blinked. The idea of a varsity athlete carrying a freshman's homework was insulting, but he looked at Vex and he looked at the charm on my bag. "The charm made me pack, and you helped the pack." Jackson grunted and walked over. He snatched my bag off the floor with one finger as if it weighed nothing. "Let's go, little man," Jackson rumbled. "Captain says you're with us." Vex looked at me, and for the first time in 3 weeks the corners of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile, it was a smirk of victory. "See you tomorrow, Leo. Don't forget the flask." She walked away, surrounded by her team, leaving me standing there with empty hands and a chest full of a strange warm feeling that I couldn't quantify with any equation. I walked out of the gym flanked by a minotaur who was carrying my differential equations textbook and wearing a scowl that could curdle milk. The walk across campus was different that day. Usually students would shoulder check me or ignore me, but walking next to Jackson with Vex's mark swinging from my bag, the crowd parted like water. I saw people looking at the charm and then looking at me with a reassessing gaze. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was flagged. I was protected. But the real test wasn't the social hierarchy. It was the physics. 2 days later, during the final practice, before the away game, Vex decided to attempt the infinite spiral. It was a move that was theoretically impossible for a biological entity. It required 4 rotations on a vertical axis while descending from a 50-foot toss. The G-force alone was enough to rupture capillaries in the eyes. The gym was empty except for the squad. The air was cold. Vex stood on the platform, her chest heaving. She was scared. I could see it. The scent of fear pheromones was faint but present. She looked at the ceiling and then she looked at the floor. The doubt was eating her alive. She was thinking about the fall. She was thinking about the pain. "Stop," I said. I didn't shout it, but in the acoustic perfection of the dome, my voice carried. Vex froze. The whole team looked at me. I had never spoken during a set before. I stood up from the bleachers and walked down to the edge of the mat. I walked right up to the base of the pyramid where Vex was preparing to climb. "You're calculating the impact," I said, looking up at her. "You're doing the math on the failure. That's my job. I've already run the numbers." Vex looked down at me, her claws digging into her palms. "And And the probability of success is 98.4%, I lied. The actual probability was closer to 60%. But she didn't need the math, she needed the certainty. She needed the mountain. The variable isn't gravity, Vex. The variable is you. If you hesitate, you change the aerodynamic coefficient. If you just fly, the math holds. Trust the math. She stared at me. She searched my face for a lie and found only the flat affect of an engineer stating a fact. I held her gaze. I didn't blink. I projected every ounce of stability I had into the space between us. I am the ground. I am the anchor. You can fly because I am not moving. She took a deep breath. The fear scent vanished. Her eyes cleared. She nodded once. Launch, she commanded. The toss was violent. She went higher than I had ever seen her go. She was a white blur against the violet skylight. 1 rotation, 2, 3, 4. It was a blur of motion that defied biology. She spun so fast she looked like a drill bit boring through the air. She hit the apex and began the descent. She didn't flail. She didn't look for the floor. She held the tuck until the very last microsecond. The catch was thunderous. The bases groaned under the impact, but they held. Vex stuck the landing in their arms, perfectly vertical, perfectly still. The gym erupted. The team was screaming, cheering, howling. But Vex didn't celebrate. She scrambled down from the pyramid and pushed through the wall of her teammates. She walked straight to me. Her hair was wild, her chest was heaving, and her eyes were burning with a gold fire that was brighter than the sun. She stopped inches from me. She was vibrating with energy. She grabbed the front of my hoodie in both fists and yanked me forward. For a second, I thought she was going to kiss me, and my heart hammered a rhythm that was definitely not calm. But she didn't. She just pressed her forehead against mine hard. You lied about the numbers, she whispered fiercely. I rounded up, I whispered back. She laughed. It was a short, sharp sound like a bark. She pulled back and looked at me, and I saw something in her face that terrified me more than the fall. I saw total, absolute trust. You balance me, she said. You keep the noise out. I'm just doing the math. I deflected, trying to keep my voice steady. No, she said softly, letting go of my hoodie but leaving her hands resting on my chest. You're the only thing in this world that doesn't want to eat me or fight me or beat me. You're just here. Don't stop being here, Leo. I'm not going anywhere, I promised. And as I stood there on the mat surrounded by sweat and monsters and glory, I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't just observing the universe. I was holding it together. The pom-pom charm on my bag clinked against the metal bench as I sat back down, but the sound wasn't ridiculous anymore. It sounded like a bell. It sounded like I belonged. The transition from being a structural engineering student to being the emotional support human for a werewolf cheer squad happened so seamlessly that I barely noticed when my entire reality shifted axis. One moment I was worrying about my midterm exams, and the next I was standing on the loading dock of the orbital transport station, wearing a team jacket that was 3 sizes too big for me, and holding a manifest of luggage that weighed more than I did. We were heading to Othries Prime for the sector semifinals, and the mood was not celebratory. Othries Prime is a high-gravity industrial world known for its dense metallic core and its inhabitants who are mostly species evolved for crushing pressure. For a human, it is like walking underwater while wearing a lead vest, but for the lichens and the minotaurs on the squad it is something far worse. It is a trigger. The oppressive gravity stimulates their bone density and testosterone production, which turns the entire team into a ticking time bomb of biological aggression. I could feel the tension radiating off the squad as we boarded the transport shuttle. Usually the flight is a time for naps and music, but today the cabin smelled like a thunderstorm. Vex was sitting in the captain's seat at the front, and she wasn't moving. She was staring out the viewport at the black void of space with a stillness that was unnatural. Her claws were dug deep into the armrests and shredding the synthetic leather. I sat 3 rows back, clutching my datapad and checking the itinerary for the 10th time just to give my hands something to do. I knew that my role here was officially listed as team manager, which was a polite administrative fiction to explain why a non-athlete was traveling on the university dime. In reality, I was a walking tranquilizer dart. The descent into Othries Prime was rough. The atmospheric turbulence rattled the shuttle like a tin can, and I watched as Jackson's eyes turned a milky white with motion sickness and rage. When the landing struts finally hit the landing pad, with a bone-jarring thud, the gravity hit us instantly. I stood up to grab my bag and my knees buckled. It felt like someone had sewn lead weights into the lining of my skin. My heart had to work harder just to pump blood to my brain. I took a deep breath, and the air tasted like iron filings and recycled exhaust. Vex was the first one off the ship. She didn't walk down the ramp so much as she stalked. The heavy gravity didn't slow her down, it just made her movements more deliberate. Every step looked like she was trying to puncture the metal grating of the spaceport floor. I scrambled to keep up, struggling with the luggage cart while the rest of the team formed a defensive phalanx around us. That is the other thing about away games. On Hellion they are celebrities. On Othries Prime they are targets. The locals here regarded the flashy, high-flying athletes from the university world as soft and arrogant. I saw a group of rock-skinned laborers near the cargo bay watching us with glowing red eyes and spitting on the ground as we passed. Vex growled low in her throat. It was a sound that you feel in your stomach rather than hear with your ears. I immediately moved up beside her, abandoning the cart to Jackson, who grabbed it without looking. I brushed my arm against hers. The contact was brief, but I felt the static charge coming off her fur. Eyes forward, I murmured, using the same tone I used when I was calibrating a sensitive laser array. Ignore the variables. Focus on the path. She didn't look at me, but her ear swiveled toward my voice. The growl cut off. She took a sharp breath and centered herself. We made it to the maglev train without incident, but I knew this was just the prelude. The real pressure was building inside her like steam in a sealed boiler. The hotel was a massive, brutalist structure built into the side of a cliff face. Everything on this planet was over-engineered to withstand the crushing weight of the atmosphere. The walls were 3 feet thick, and the doors were solid steel plates. It felt less like a hotel and more like a bunker. We checked in, and the team dispersed to their rooms with strict orders to stay inside until the mandatory team meal at 1800 hours. I was assigned a room adjacent to Vex's suite, ostensibly to help with logistics, but really to act as a firewall between her and the world. I spent the first hour unpacking the medical kits and setting up the portable hydration station I had designed. The heavier gravity meant they would dehydrate twice as fast, and their electrolyte balance would be critical. I was mixing a batch of the Leo Special when I heard the crash. It sounded like furniture being thrown through a wall. I dropped the mixing spoon and ran into the hallway. The noise was coming from Vex's room. I didn't hesitate. I keyed in the override code she had given me, and the heavy steel door slid open with a hiss. The room was a wreck. The heavy bolted-down furniture had been ripped from the floor. The mattress was shredded. Vex was standing in the center of the chaos, packing in a tight circle. She wasn't wearing her team jacket anymore. She was in a sports bra and compression shorts, and I could see the muscles in her back writhing under her skin as if something was trying to break out. Her fur was standing on end, making her look twice her size. She was panting, breaths coming in ragged gasps that sounded like tearing fabric. Jackson was there too, standing by the window with his hands raised. He looked terrified. For a creature who could tackle a transport vehicle, seeing him cower was deeply unsettling. "Calm down, Captain," Jackson shouted, his voice booming in the small space. "You need to snap out of it, fight it." That was the wrong thing to say. You don't tell a storm to fight itself. Vex whipped around and snarled at him. Her face was changing. The muzzle was elongating and her teeth were fully extended. This wasn't just stress. This was a pre-shift panic attack. The gravity and the hostility of the planet were tricking her biology into thinking she was in a life-or-death combat scenario. Her body was trying to transform into her war form to survive. "Get out," she roared at Jackson. It wasn't a human voice. It was a distortion of vocal cords that were reshaping themselves. Jackson looked at me as I stepped into the room. "She's shifting," he warned, backing toward the door. "It's too early. If she shifts now, she'll burn out before the competition. She'll tear this room apart." "Leave," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It was flat. It was the voice of a man reading a user manual. Jackson hesitated, looking between the monster in the middle of the room and the fragile human standing in the doorway. "Leo, she's dangerous right now. She doesn't know who you are." "She knows," I said. "Go." Jackson swallowed hard and slipped past me into the hall. I hit the door panel, and the steel slab slid shut, locking us in. Vex stopped packing. She turned her head slowly toward the sound of the door closing. Her eyes were pure gold, now no white visible at all. She looked at me, and I saw zero recognition. I saw a predator assessing a prey animal. She lowered her head and took a step toward me. Her claws clicked against the metal floor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my breathing to remain slow. I didn't back away. I didn't raise my hands in surrender. I just stood there with my hands at my sides, open and empty. I looked at the structural beam running across the ceiling directly above her head. "The load-bearing capacity of this room is insufficient for dynamic stress," I said. Vex paused. Her ear flicked. The words meant nothing to a wolf, but the cadence was familiar. "The localized gravity is 1.4 gs. I continued, keeping my rhythm perfectly steady. "That increases the tensile load on the skeletal structure by 40%. You feel heavy because you are heavy. It is just physics. It is not a threat. It is just mass times acceleration." She took another step. She was 3 feet away. I could smell the ozone coming off her skin. I could see the pulse fluttering wildly in her throat. She growled again, a low, rumbling warning that vibrated in my shoes. I didn't flinch. I took a step toward her. "The arch is the strongest shape in nature," I said, stepping into her personal space. "It distributes weight outward and downward. It turns pressure into stability. You are under pressure, Vex, but you don't have to break. You just have to distribute the load." I was close enough to touch her now. She towered over me. She was trembling so violently that her teeth were chattering. She raised a hand, her claws hooked and ready to strike. It was a reflex. She was expecting me to attack, so she was preparing to defend. I didn't attack. I sat down. I sat right there on the floor in front of her amidst the ruin of the furniture. I crossed my legs and rested my hands on my knees. I looked up at her, exposing my throat. It was the most dangerous thing I could possibly do, and the only thing that would work. I removed myself as a threat. I became a static object. I became the floor. "Sit down," I said softly. "The floor is reinforced concrete. It will hold you." Vex stared down at me. Her chest heaved. The biological imperative to fight was crashing against the lack of an enemy. She looked around the room for something to kill, but there was only me, and I was talking about concrete. She let out a whimper. It was a high, thin sound that broke my heart. The war form receded slightly. Her muzzle shortened. She dropped to her knees, not gracefully but collapsing under the weight of her own exhaustion. She landed in front of me, her hands bracing against the floor. She was still shaking. I reached out slowly, letting her see my hand every inch of the way. I placed my palm flat against the center of her chest, right over her sternum. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a vibration rather than a rhythm. "Match me," I whispered. I took a deep, exaggerated breath in through my nose, counting to 4 in my head. I held it for 4. I released it for 4. Vex stared at my chest, watching it rise and fall. She blinked, and the gold in her eyes receded just a fraction, revealing the terrified girl underneath. She tried to take a breath, but it hitched in her throat. Again I coached. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, look at me, just look at me. I'm not moving." She locked eyes with me. We sat there on the floor of a destroyed hotel room on a hostile planet, breathing in unison. Slowly, painfully, the monster retreated. Her claws retracted, her fur smoothed down. The red flush faded from her skin. Her heart rate under my hand began to slow down, decoupling from the panic and syncing with mine. She slumped forward until her forehead rested on my shoulder. Her arms came up and wrapped around me, squeezing tight enough to bruise, but not enough to break. She buried her face in the crook of my neck and breathed in the scent of my soap and my fearlessness. I almost lost it, she whispered, her voice thick and wet. The noise, it's so loud here, everything wants to hurt me. Nothing is going to hurt you, I said, moving my hand to the back of her head and stroking her hair. I checked the structural integrity. The walls are solid, the door is locked, and I'm right here. You're crazy, she mumbled into my neck. I could have killed you. I wanted to kill something. You wouldn't kill me, I said with a confidence I didn't feel. I'm your balance. You don't destroy your own center of gravity. She pulled back slightly, just enough to look at my face. Her eyes were human again, but they were raw and unguarded. She looked at me with a mixture of awe and confusion, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that had no edges. Why aren't you afraid? She asked. Everyone is afraid of me. Jackson is afraid of me. My own mother is afraid of me when I get like this. Why aren't you? I thought about it. I thought about the first time I saw her fall. I thought about the way she looked at me when she realized I hadn't let her drop. Because I know how the machine works, I said quietly. You aren't a monster, Vex. You're just a high-performance engine running hot. You don't need fear. You need coolant. You need a governor. That's what I am. I'm just the regulator. She shook her head slowly. No, she said, you're not a part of the machine, Leo. You're the pilot. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and significant. She wasn't just saying I helped her. She was saying I guided her. She was giving me control. For a Lycan Alpha to cede control is almost unheard of. It was an intimacy deeper than anything physical. It was a surrender. She leaned her forehead against mine again. Stay, she commanded. Don't leave the room tonight. If you leave, the noise comes back. I'll stay, I promised. We sat there for a long time until her breathing was perfectly rhythmic. Then I helped her up and we salvaged what we could of the bed. I didn't sleep in it. I sat in the only chair that wasn't broken, positioned by the door with my datapad, reading structural schematics of the stadium while she slept. Every time she stirred or whimpered in her sleep, I would clear my throat or shift in the chair just to make a sound, just to let her know I was there. And every time she would settle, instantly anchored by the presence of her human safety switch. The next morning was the competition. The shift in the dynamic was palpable. When we walked down to the transport bus, Vex didn't walk in front of me. She walked beside me. Her shoulder brushed mine with every step. The team saw it. Jackson saw it. He looked at the bruises on my neck from where she had held me too tight, and then he looked at the calm focus in her eyes. He didn't say a word. He just nodded at me and moved to load the gear. The stadium on Othries Prime was a nightmare of acoustics. It was a dome made of reverberating steel that amplified the screaming of the crowd into a physical assault. The gravity emitters in the floor were set to fluctuating intervals to test the athletes' adaptability. It was a cruel arena designed to break the weak. But Vex didn't break. She was terrifyingly calm. While the other teams were packing and psyching themselves up with chants and aggression, Vex stood perfectly still near the bench. She had her eyes closed and one hand resting on my shoulder. I was reading her the atmospheric pressure readings from my datapad in a low, monotone voice. To anyone else it would have been boring. To her, it was a meditation. When they called Hellion University to the floor, she squeezed my shoulder once and opened her eyes. They were clear. They were sharp. "Watch me," she said. "Always," I replied. The performance was flawless. It wasn't the frantic, explosive power she usually relied on. It was controlled. It was precise. She moved through the heavy gravity like it was water flowing around obstacles rather than fighting them. The arch theory I had babbled about during her panic attack seemed to have stuck. She used the pressure of the gravity to ground her bases, and then used the rebound to launch herself higher than anyone else. During the final pyramid sequence, the crowd was screaming so loud the floor shook. The Othries team had tried to intimidate us by stomping their feet, creating a rhythmic earthquake. Vex was at the very top of the formation, 3 tiers high. She locked eyes with me on the sidelines. I gave her the signal, a single tapped finger against my chest over my heart. Steady. She smiled. It was the first time I had ever seen her smile during a routine. It wasn't a predator's snarl. It was a genuine expression of joy. She hit the dismount, spinning through the heavy air, and landed with a grace that silenced the hostile crowd. We won. It wasn't even close. The judges cited unprecedented control and synchronization as the deciding factor. The locker room celebration was chaotic. Champagne and energy drinks were flying everywhere, but Vex pulled me out of the fray. She dragged me into the equipment storage closet and kicked the door shut. The adrenaline of the win was coursing through her, but this time it wasn't fear. It was triumph. She looked at me, her face flushed and her eyes bright. "We did it," she said. "You did it," I corrected. "I just held the clipboard." She grabbed my team jacket by the lapels and pulled me down to her level. "Stop doing that," she said fiercely. "Stop pretending you aren't the reason I'm standing here. I know what I am, Leo. I know what happens to flyers who can't turn it off. They burn out. They get hurt. They get cut. You saved me, last night and today." She didn't wait for me to argue. She leaned in and pressed her cheek against mine. It was a gesture of affection that I had seen lichens use with their mates and their cubs. It was a scent marking. She was rubbing her scent on me and taking mine on her. "You are essential personnel," she whispered in my ear. "You are not allowed to transfer. You are not allowed to quit. You belong to the squad. You belong to me." My heart did a flip that had nothing to do with gravity. I stood there in the dark closet, holding the most powerful creature I had ever met, and realizing that she was terrified of losing me. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, repeating the promise I made the night before. She pulled back and looked at me. "Good, because next week is the Galactic Championship on home turf, and I have a feeling we're going to need more than just breathing exercises." She was right, of course. We had survived the away game. We had survived the gravity. But as we walked out of the stadium and back to the ship, I caught Jackson looking at a news feed on his datapad. His face was grim. He showed the screen to Vex, and I saw her expression darken instantly. The rival team from the Cybertech Institute had just arrived on Hellion early, and they weren't just bringing athletes. They were bringing tech, jammers, gravity distorters, things that could make a girl fall even if she did everything right. Vex looked at the screen and then at me. The fear didn't come back, but the protective instinct did. She moved closer to me, placing her body between me and the world. "Let them come," she said softly. "I have an engineer." And for the first time, I didn't feel like a fraud. I felt like a weapon, a quiet, boring, stable weapon, and I was ready to be deployed. The return to Hellion campus should have been a victory lap, but instead it felt like walking into a quarantine zone where the contagion was paranoia. The news of our win on Othries Prime had beaten us home, but so had the Cybertech Institute. Their transport ship was docked in the primary orbital cradle, and it cast a long, jagged shadow over the athletic sector that seemed to darken the very mood of the university. Unlike the organic curves of the Hellion shuttles, the Cybertech vessel was a brutalist slab of matte black composite and exposed wiring that looked less like a vehicle and more like a weapon that had been deactivated specifically to intimidate the locals. I stood on the tarmac watching Vex stare at that ship, and for the first time since I had met her, I didn't see the fire of competition in her eyes. I saw the cold calculation of a soldier assessing a minefield. The atmosphere on campus had shifted from the usual boisterous rivalry to a tense electric silence. The Cybertech athletes were already integrating into the local ecosystem, and they were terrifying in a completely different way than the lichens or the minotaurs. They were heavily augmented cyborgs who had traded biology for efficiency. I saw them in the cafeteria processing nutrient pastes through intake ports, and I saw them on the quad calibrating their limb actuators with laser precision. They didn't sweat. They didn't laugh. They didn't have packs or social hierarchies. They were a hive mind of synchronized data, and to a team like ours which ran on emotion and instinct, they were the ultimate predator because you cannot intimidate a machine. Vex responded to this threat the only way she knew how, which was to push the physical limits of her body until they broke. She called for double sessions starting at 400 hours and running until the gym lights automatically dimmed for the night cycle. The rest of the squad was exhausted, their fur losing its sheen and their eyes dull with fatigue, but they followed her because she was the captain, and because they could smell the threat in the air just as clearly as she could. I was there for every minute of it, sitting in my usual spot on the bleachers, which had now become a makeshift command center cluttered with hydration formulas and biometric scanners. My role had evolved from emotional anchor to systems analyst. I wasn't just watching Vex anymore, I was monitoring the entire environment, because I knew that cybertech didn't play by the rules of flesh and blood. They played by the rules of code and voltage. It was 3 nights before the championship when the variable finally presented itself. The gym was technically closed, but Vex had overridden the lock protocols with her captain's clearance. The main overhead arrays were off, leaving the massive dome illuminated only by the perimeter emergency lights and the faint violet glow of the moon filtering through the transparent ceiling. The shadows were long and sharp, creating a visual distortion that made the simple act of catching a flyer significantly more dangerous. The squad was running the supernova sequence, a high-risk maneuver that involved a synchronized launch of 3 flyers with Vex in the center, aiming for a ceiling grazing altitude of 50 feet. I was tired. My eyes were burning from staring at the blue light of my datapad, and my back ached from the rigid plastic of the stadium seating. I had put my headphones around my neck to rub my temples, and that was the only reason I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. To a lichen or an avian, the world is a symphony of biological noises. They hear heartbeats and breathing, and the friction of skin against synthetic fabric. Their ears are tuned by millions of years of evolution to detect the snap of a twig or the rustle of prey in the grass. But they tune out the hum of the civilized world. To them, the buzz of the air recyclers and the thrum of the gravity plating is just white noise background static that their brains delete to focus on the hunt. But I am an engineer. I have spent my entire life listening to the song of machines. I know what a capacitor sounds like when it is charging, and I know the specific harmonic frequency of a gravity emitter when it is maintaining a stable 1G field. This sound was wrong. It was a high-pitched whine barely audible on the edge of human hearing, like a mosquito made of copper wire. It wasn't a steady hum. It was oscillating. It was climbing in pitch, syncing perfectly with the rhythmic stomping of the cheer squad's cadence. I stood up slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself. I looked down at the floor. The gym floor at Hellion is a marvel of engineering, a grid of magnetic suspension plates that provide shock absorption. It is supposed to be a passive system. It reacts to impact. It does not generate force. But the sound I was hearing was the sound of active generation. Someone had tweaked the voltage on the central array directly under the 50-yard line. I looked at the formation. Jackson and the heavy bases were setting up right on top of the center logo. Vex was at the back preparing for her run-up. She was going to hit that spot in exactly 10 seconds. If the gravity plate was set to surge when she made contact for the launch, it wouldn't just push her. It would act like a railgun. It would magnify the force of the throw by a factor of 10. She wouldn't just go 50 feet up. She would be launched into the support trusses of the ceiling at a velocity that would liquefy her internal organs upon impact. I didn't scream. Screaming would startle the bases. If they flinched while she was running, she could trip and break a leg. A broken leg was bad, but being turned into biological paste against a steel girder was worse. I needed to stop the floor, not the girl. I dropped my datapad and sprinted toward the maintenance panel on the far wall near the bleachers. I moved with a speed that surprised me, vaulting over the railing of the stands and landing in a crouch. I scrambled to the panel and ripped the cover off, exposing the fiber-optic nervous system of the gym. Vex began her run. I could hear her claws digging into the mat, thud, 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 accelerating toward the launch point. I jacked my multi-tool directly into the service port. My hands were shaking, but my mind was ice cold. I didn't have time to brute force the password. I had to bypass the logic controller entirely. I watched the code scrolling on my small diagnostic screen. It was cybertech encryption, complex and nasty, designed to look like a system error, so that after the accident the logs would just show a malfunction. They hadn't counted on a human structural engineer who knew the facility's schematics better than the janitors did. 5 seconds. Vex hit the transition point, leaping into Jackson's hands. I found the surge command. It was buried in a subroutine linked to the pressure sensors. As soon as the weight on the plate exceeded 400 pounds, the combined weight of the base pyramid, the voltage was set to spike to maximum output. 3 seconds. Jackson braced his legs. The other bases locked arms. The coil whine in the room pitched up into a scream that only I could hear. It was charging. I didn't try to delete the command. Deleting took too long. I inverted the polarity. I typed the override sequence so fast my fingers were a blur, relying on muscle memory and pure desperate instinct. Value positive to value negative. Output to input. Push to pull. 1 second. Up, Jackson roared, and the bases heaved upward with all their strength. At the exact moment they threw her, I hit the enter key. The floor didn't surge upward. It collapsed downward. The gravity plates in the center of the room instantly reversed their polarity, creating a localized heavy gravity well for a split second. Instead of adding energy to the throw, the floor sucked the kinetic energy right out of the bases' legs. The result was chaos. Jackson and the bases were pulled down to their knees as if a giant invisible hand had slapped them. The throw lost 80% of its power. Vex didn't shoot into the ceiling. She popped into the air a pathetic 5 feet, barely clearing Jackson's head. She flailed in the air, confused by the sudden lack of momentum. She came down awkwardly, but because the height was so low, she didn't crash. She landed in a crouch on top of the collapsing pyramid of bases, sliding off Jackson's massive shoulder and rolling onto the mat. The gym went silent. The whine of the coils died instantly as the system reset. Vex was on her feet in a heartbeat, her eyes flashing gold, her claws out. She spun around, looking for the enemy, looking for the thing that had ruined the stunt. She glared at Jackson. "What was that?" she snarled. "You dropped the throw, you buckled." Jackson was pushing himself up from the floor, looking at his own legs with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I didn't drop it, Captain. The floor. It grabbed me. It felt like the gravity on Othries Prime for a second. It pulled us down." "Physics doesn't just change, Jackson." Vex shouted, her stress finally boiling over into rage. "You are weak. You are tired, and you are making excuses." "He's not making excuses," I said. My voice cut through the shouting. I was standing by the open maintenance panel, holding my multi-tool like a weapon. The entire squad turned to look at me. I walked out onto the floor, my heart finally starting to pound now that the crisis was over. I felt a cold fury rising in my chest, a sensation I wasn't used to. It wasn't the hot rage of the lichens. It was the cold, hard anger of an engineer who sees someone abusing a machine to hurt people. "He didn't buckle," I said, walking straight to the center of the mat where the logo was painted. The floor was rigged. Someone planted a gravity surge command in the load sensors. If I hadn't reversed the polarity at the last second, you wouldn't have just missed the stunt, Vex. You would have hit the ceiling trusses at roughly 80 miles per hour. You would be dead. Vex went still. The rage vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden horrifying realization. She looked up at the dark steel girders of the roof high above us, and then back down at me. "Show me," she whispered. I held up my datapad, projecting the code logs into the air between us. Here, timestamp matches the start of practice. Remote access from a localized IP address. It's a cybertech signature masked as a maintenance protocol. And here, I pointed to the jagged red line on the graph. This is the power output. It was set to discharge a Class 4 kinetic pulse. That's enough force to launch a shuttle, not a cheerleader. The squad gathered around the hologram. The silence in the gym was absolute. They weren't looking at the code, they were looking at the reality of what it meant. This wasn't a prank. It was an assassination attempt disguised as a sporting accident. Jackson growled a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the floor. They tried to kill the captain. They tried to eliminate the variable, I said, closing the projection. They know they can't beat you on the mats, so they decided to beat you with physics. They didn't count on you having a countermeasure. Vex looked at me. Her eyes were wide, searching my face. She walked over to me, stepping into my personal space with a deliberate slowness. She reached out and took the multi-tool from my hand, looking at it as if it were a holy relic, and then she looked at the open panel on the wall. "You heard it," she said, "with all our senses, with all our evolution. None of us heard it, but you did." "It was a coil whine," I said, shrugging as if it were nothing. 15 kilohertz. It's annoying." She didn't smile. She reached out and grabbed the front of my shirt, pulling me close. But this wasn't like the other times. She didn't rest her head on me. She looked me in the eye, holding my gaze with a fierce intensity. "You are not just a mascot, Leo," she said, her voice ringing clear in the empty gym. "And you are not just a balance. You are the guardian of this pack. You saw the trap and you disarmed it. You saved the pack." She turned to the team, still holding onto me. "From this moment on, Leo has alpha clearance. If he says stop, you stop. If he says move, you move. If he tells you the floor is lava, you assume he has calculated the thermodynamics and you fly. Understood?" "Understood." The squad roared in unison, a sound that shook the walls. Jackson slammed his fist against his chest in a salute that was usually reserved for war chiefs. Vex turned back to me. "Can you trace the signal?" "I already did," I said. "It originated from the guest dorms, room 402, the cybertech captain's suite." Vex's eyes narrowed into slits. "Good. Then we know exactly where to send the message." "No," I said firmly. "If you go there and tear his door down, you get disqualified. That's what they want. They want you to lose control. They want the monster." "So what do?" she demanded, her claws flexing. "Let them get away with it." "No," I said. "We beat them. We beat them so badly that their tech doesn't matter. And we let them know that we know. I'm going to send a packet to their captain's personal server right now. Just the logs. Just the code of me revering their trap. Let them know that their best hack was beaten by a freshman with a multi-tool. Let them be the ones who are afraid." Vex looked at me for a long moment, and then a slow, terrifying grin spread across her face. It was the smile of a wolf who realizes the trap has been sprung on the hunter. "You really are dangerous, aren't you?" she murmured. "I'm just thorough," I said. We finished practice early that night. The mood had changed. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, focused determination. The squad walked me back to my dorm, not as an escort but as a phalanx. When we reached my building, Vex stopped me at the door. She didn't say goodbye. She unzipped her flight jacket and took it off, draping it over my shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled like cedar and ozone. "Wear it," she commanded. "Tomorrow is the championship. I want everyone to see it. I want them to know who you belong to." I pulled the jacket tighter around me. "See you at 0800, I said. She leaned in and brushed her lips against my cheek. It was barely a touch, a ghost of a kiss, but it burned like a brand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping my feet on the ground." She turned and ran into the night, disappearing into the shadows with her pack. I stood there for a moment, watching her go, wearing the jacket of the most popular girl in the galaxy, feeling the weight of the multi-tool in my pocket. I touched the spot on my cheek where she had kissed me. The Cybertech Institute had brought lasers and gravity disruptors and algorithms to a fight. They thought they were the future. They thought they were superior. But as I walked into my quiet dorm room and sat down at my computer to prepare for the final game, I knew something they didn't. You can engineer a perfect machine, and you can calculate a perfect trajectory. But you cannot engineer the kind of loyalty that makes a 60-pound engineer jump into a gravity well to save a monster. The next day was going to be a war, and for the first time in my life I wasn't planning to hide in the bunker. I was planning to drive the tank. The morning of the Galactic Championship did not dawn with the sun, but rather with the thrumming vibration of 100,000 atmospheric thrusters engaging at once. The orbital lanes above Hellion campus were gridlocked with transport ships from every sector of the coalition, and the sky was a chaotic mosaic of chrome and exhaust trails. I stood in the center of the locker room surrounded by the smell of nervous sweat and high-grade muscle balm, wearing Vex's flight jacket, which was still too big for me, and feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on the roof. The noise outside was a physical force, a dull roar that penetrated the reinforced concrete walls like the approach of a tidal wave. It was the sound of the entire galaxy waiting to see if the wolves of Hellion would fly or if they would fall. Vex was packing. She moved back and forth across the rubberized floor with the kinetic energy of a trapped lightning bolt. She was in her full competition uniform, a sleek armored bodysuit of white and gold that looked less like sportswear and more like a ceremonial warplate. Her hair was braided tight against her skull to prevent drag, and her face was painted with the traditional clan markings of her people's stripes of black ash under her eyes that absorbed the glare of the arena lights. She wasn't growling today. She was silent. It was a terrifying, focused silence that scared the rookies more than her shouting ever did. She stopped in front of me, and the rest of the room seemed to vanish. She reached out and adjusted the collar of the jacket she had given me, pulling it straighter. "Heart rate," she demanded quietly. 62 beats per minute, I replied without looking at my watch. Blood pressure 110/70. Stress levels within nominal parameters. She inhaled deeply, drawing the scent of my calm into her lungs. Her golden eyes locked onto mine, and for a second I saw the flicker of the girl who had fallen into my arms weeks ago. She was searching for the fear. She expected me to be terrified because any rational biological entity would be terrified. We were about to walk into an arena filled with hostile species and perform stunts that defied the laws of physics while a team of cyborgs waited to dismantle us. But I wasn't afraid. I had checked the math. I had reinforced the variables. I was the mountain. "Good," she said. "Keep it there. If you spike, I spike. If I spike, we lose." The tunnel leading to the arena floor was a dark throat that swallowed the light. We lined up in formation, Jackson at the front looking like a siege engine in shoulder pads and Vex right behind him. I walked at the flank holding the datapad that contained our entire strategy. As we walked, we passed the Cybertech team. They were standing in their tunnel, a row of identical monochromatic soldiers. Their captain was a tall cyborg with an ocular implant that glowed a menacing red. He looked at Vex, and then his mechanical eye swiveled to me. He didn't sneer. He paused. He recognized me. He had received the data packet I sent the night before. He knew that I knew how to break his toys. He looked away first. We emerged into the light, and the sound hit us like a physical blow. The stadium was a colossal bowl of noise. The stands went up for nearly a mile, towering vertical cliffs of screaming fans waving flags and stomping their feet. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn and ozone and alien pheromones. It was sensory overload, a chaotic data stream that would crash any unshielded processor. I saw Vex flinch, her ears flattening against her head as the wall of sound washed over her. She looked like she was about to snap. I stepped up beside her right on the sideline where I wasn't supposed to be. I didn't touch her because the cameras were watching, but I spoke in that low, resonant frequency that I knew cut through the static. "It is just noise, Vex," I said. "It is just acoustic vibration. It has no mass. It has no force. It cannot push you down. Look at the floor. The floor is solid. I checked the struts myself. She looked at the floor, then she looked at me. Her ears swiveled forward. The panic receded, replaced by the cold, hard durasteel of her resolve. She nodded once, a microscopic dip of her chin. Then she ran onto the field, and the roar of the crowd changed from a threat to a worshipful chant. The competition was brutal. The Cybertech Institute went first, and their performance was a masterclass in efficiency. They moved with mathematical perfection, every toss exactly the same height, every catch landing on the exact same millisecond. It was impressive, but it was cold. It lacked the soul of the sport. It was engineering without art. They finished their routine without a single error, and the judges awarded them a near-perfect technical score. The pressure on us was absolute. To beat perfection, you cannot just be good. You have to be impossible. Hellion took the floor. The music started, a primal drum beat that synced with the hearts of the audience. Vex led the squad through the opening sequence, a furious display of tumbling passes that looked like a chaotic brawl but was actually a precisely choreographed dance. I stood on the sideline watching the telemetry on my datapad. Vex's heart rate was high but steady. She was in the zone. Then came the finale, the orbital drop. This was the stunt that had nearly killed her the day we met. But this time, we had modified it. This time, instead of just catching her, the bases were going to relaunch her, instantly turning a fall into a rebound. It required a level of trust that bordered on insanity. Vex climbed the pyramid. She stood on Jackson's hands 40 feet in the air. The stadium went silent. Every eye was on her. She looked down at the drop zone. She didn't look at Jackson. She didn't look at the floor. She looked at the sideline. She looked at me. I was standing with my arms crossed, the jacket loose on my shoulders, the pom-pom charm on my bag glinting in the stadium lights. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just stood there perfectly still. I was the reference point. I was zero. She took a breath and launched. The crowd gasped as she spun through the air. 1, 2, 3 rotations. She plummeted toward the floor at terminal velocity. It looked like a suicide dive. But just as she hit the catch zone, the bases absorbed her momentum and fired it back upward. She didn't stop. She bounced. She shot back up into the air higher than before, performing a second sequence of twists on the ascent. It was defying gravity. It was rewriting the laws of motion. She landed the final dismount in the center of the mat, her chest heaving, her fist raised in the air. The silence held for 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, and then the stadium exploded. It wasn't just applause. It was bedlam. People were crying. The judges were standing up. The scoreboard flashed the numbers, and they were higher than perfection. They included points for difficulty that hadn't been awarded in a decade. We had won. The celebration was a blur of confetti and screaming. I tried to stay on the sideline to pack up my gear and disappear into the tunnels, as was my protocol. I was the engineer. My job was done. The machine had worked, but the machine had other ideas. I saw the media swarm, rushing the field, a tide of floating cameras and shouting reporters. They surrounded Vex, thrusting microphones into her face, asking her about the training, asking her about the strategy, asking her how she overcame the cybertech precision. "Captain Vex," a reporter shouted, "your recovery rates are unprecedented. You moved with a stability we have never seen from a Lycan flyer. What is your secret? What changed in your training camp?" Vex stopped. She looked at the camera, and then she looked over the heads of the reporters. She scanned the sideline until she found me trying to sneak away toward the exit ramp. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me," she said, pushing the microphone aside. She walked through the press corps like an icebreaker moving through a frozen sea. The reporters parted, scrambling to get out of her way. She walked straight across the mats, ignoring the cheering fans, ignoring her team, ignoring everything, until she was standing in front of me. I froze, my hand halfway to the zipper of my backpack. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice amplified by the silence of the immediate area. "Back to the dorm," I said. "You have interviews. You have a trophy to hold." "I am not holding that trophy without you," she said. She reached out and took my hand. Her grip was firm, warm, and undeniable. She pulled me past the security line, past the stunned reporters, and right into the center of the field. She pulled me under the blinding lights of the victory podium. The giant holographic screens above the arena projected our faces to billions of viewers. The terrifying white wolf and the quiet human boy in the oversized jacket. A reporter shoved a microphone at us. "Captain, who is this? Is this a new trainer?" Vex looked at the reporter and then she looked at the camera. She squeezed my hand. She stood tall, her chest out, her head high, the apex predator of the galaxy. "People think that flying is about power," she said, her voice ringing through the stadium speakers. "They think it is about how hard you can push against the ground. But they are wrong. Flying is about knowing that when you come down, the ground will be there to catch you." She turned and looked at me, and for the first time she let the whole galaxy see the softness in her eyes. "This is Leo," she announced. "He is not a trainer. He is my gravity. He is the reason I don't drift away. And he is the only reason any of us are standing here today." She unclipped the gold medal the officials had just placed around her neck. It was heavy, a solid disc of platinum and starlight. She turned to me, and before I could protest, she placed it over my head. It hung there heavy against the flight jacket. "It belongs to the architect," she whispered. The crowd roared, but I didn't hear them. I only heard her breathing. I only saw her. The strongest creature in the universe had just told the world that she needed me. And in that moment, surrounded by the noise and the glory, I finally understood the equation. I wasn't balancing her. We were a binary system. We were orbiting each other. The night ended not with a party, but with silence. The team had gone to the victory gala to drink champagne and howl at the moon, but Vex and I had slipped away. We climbed the service ladder to the roof of the orbital gym, the highest point on campus. The air up here was thin and cold, and the stars of the Hellion system burned with a fierce clarity above us. We sat on the edge of the roof, our legs dangling over the side, looking down at the campus, which was lit up in celebration. I was still wearing the medal. Vex was still wearing her uniform, though she had wiped the war paint from her face. She had a bottle of the cheap electrolyte mix I made her in one hand, and she was sipping it like it was a vintage wine. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "Jackson asked me if I was going to eat you." "Legitimate question," I said, staring at the horizon. "Given the statistical probability of interspecies predation on this campus." "I told him that I couldn't eat you," she said, shifting closer until her arm was pressed against mine. "Because then I would have to do my own math, and I hate math." I laughed. It was a short, dry sound, but it felt good. "I can teach you, it's just logic." "No," she said. She rested her head on my shoulder. The weight of it was familiar now. It was heavy and warm and right. "I don't want to learn it. I want you to do it for me. I want you to always be the one who checks the numbers." "I can do that," I said. She sighed, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to carry the last of the season's stress away with it. "They are going to talk, you know. The media. The campus. They are going to say it's weird. A wolf and a human. A flyer and an engineer. They are going to say it doesn't make sense." I looked at the pom-pom charm clipped to my bag, which sat between us. I thought about the way the floor had collapsed to save her life. I thought about the way her panic vanished when she heard my heartbeat. "Thermodynamics doesn't make sense to a poet," I said softly, "but it still keeps the lights on. Let them talk. We have the data." Vex smiled against my shoulder. She reached out and interlaced her fingers with mine, her claws retracted, her skin soft against my palm. She closed her eyes. "Yeah," she murmured, drifting toward sleep, the adrenaline finally leaving her system. "We have the data." We sat there for a long time as the moons of Hellion rose into the sky. 2 different worlds, 2 different species, sitting on a roof at the edge of the galaxy. It defied every social law of the campus, and it contradicted every biological imperative of her species. But as I sat there, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and the warmth of her hand in mine, I knew the truth. It wasn't a contradiction. It was an equilibrium. The monster had found her quiet place. The invisible boy had found his spotlight. And for the first time in the history of the universe, the equation was perfectly balanced.